Hey there, Agile mantis shrimps. You can see in colors that human beings can't see, and your claws are so powerful they actually make the water boil around them. And welcome to another episode of Agile Bites, the podcast sponsored by Integrity Inspired Solutions, where we build software in an agile manner day in and day out. You know, in the last episode and this episode and probably the next episode as well, I'm trying to come around and address some things that people have asked me to address since I did the State of the Podcast episode, because I did talk about transitioning the podcast to talk more to managers or from the standpoint of managers about agility and agile issues, and that is still the plan. However, many of you really responded with some great input and said, hey, before you do that, I would really like to see you talk about this topic, that other topic, or whatever. And this is one of those things. And today we're going to talk about scaling. I'm going to try hard to keep this framework agnostic. So when you think about like the quote unquote agile scaling frameworks, you know, we're talking about SAFe, we're talking about less, the other one, you know, there's just a number of them out there. That Scrum at Scale, that's what I was trying to think of. That there's all kinds of frameworks out there that have been developed for this. This episode is not about the pros and cons of these frameworks or to help you pick the best one. The reason that I don't want to do that is because I think this is a great example of asking a question where I'm not helping you by answering it. If your question is, what scaling agile framework is the best? I don't think I'm giving you the most value by answering that question. I think I'm going to give you the most value by walking you back a few steps. Let's take a look at how we even ended up in the position where you are asking yourself, which scaling framework should your organization use? Because this is not my first rodeo with this question. And the way I have seen the vast majority of companies who adopt a scaled framework like SAFe or something like that, here's how this has happened. See if this matches your story at all. But you've got a mid to large size company, and for whatever reason, usually none at all, they decide that all their teams are going to start doing Scrum because they know they're supposed to be agile, and a highly paid consultant like myself has told them that you got to do Scrum. That's the only possible way anybody could ever be agile, or that agile and Scrum are the same thing or whatever. And so this organization just mandates that everyone starts using Scrum. They do, and then instantly begin to feel pain. Some of this pain may come from the fact that maybe Scrum wasn't the right choice for the kind of product work the organization is doing. Not only is that possible, I actually think that's a very common thing, honestly. But some of the pain comes from the fact, and this is by design, that the processes that you had in place prior to this endeavor are just not designed for high agility. Whether we're talking about planning or budgeting or requirements or whatever part of the product development process we're talking about, the processes you had in place were not agile to begin with. And now you've dropped a iterative development framework in the middle of your product development enterprise, and it's painful. And it's supposed to be to a certain extent, because that pain then shows you, theoretically, what other things you're doing that don't accommodate agility. And you begin to transform those as well, right? But that's not what happens, because you did not do Scrum because you were trying to transform all your processes. You were doing Scrum because somebody told you it made software development go faster or better or whatever. So you're trying to do Scrum. A lot of teams are struggling with it. The organization is struggling with it. It's a big struggle. And instead of looking at the actual problem, which is either Scrum wasn't right to begin with, or we have a lot of processes that don't allow Scrum to bring forth agility into our processes, somebody, usually another highly paid consultant, convinces us, well, it's because we're big. It's because we're a big company. Scrum only addresses developers primarily, but we have all these other things we got to worry about, you know, governance boards and, you know, 5-year-long roadmaps and all this other stuff. And Scrum doesn't really address those things. We're just too big. And that's really what the problem is. And there is a fairly predatory segment of consultants Usually they are framework-specific consultants who will happily convince you this is the case, that the reason you are struggling with Scrum is because you're just big and you need a framework that accommodates your bigitude better than Scrum does. And then you start doing safe or whatever. And you start doing that framework with just as little thought or introspection or intentionality as bringing Scrum in the first place. So you kind of see we've already made a ton of mistakes even getting to this point, right? Very few organizations that are using a scaled framework, I find, and this is anecdotal, okay? I haven't done research. I don't know actual statistics, so just take this with a grain of salt. But in my own experience, most organizations that have decided to use a scaling framework have not carefully thought about why they need to scale, or maybe even why they wanted to have an agile framework in the first place. It's just kind of a very short-circuited thought process. Hey, we got to be agile. Okay, well, let's do Scrum. Oh, hey, we're big. Okay, well, then we must need a scaled framework. And there's a lot of problematic assumptions in that thought process. So if that's how you ended up with a scaled framework or considering a scaled framework, I want to tell you, you may not be in the right place. A scaled framework, and by the way, this is not a recommendation that people in this situation should use scaled frameworks, but here's what they were designed for. A scaled framework is designed to address the situation where you have numerous teams, usually working on the same product, and there is some reason why all these teams' deliveries need to coordinate. Usually because there's a common deadline for the product and all the team's efforts need to converge by that deadline. Or, and this is basically the same thing, there's a particular release cadence that happens. And so all the teams have to have their stuff in it. Or the teams have dependencies on the work of other teams. Therefore, that work has to be coordinated so we make sure that all teams can be moving forward. These are the scenarios that a scaled framework was designed to address. They are not designed to help big organizations who are struggling with Scrum do Scrum better or do what Scrum could have done if Scrum were just bigger. That's not what they're for. Just because you're big doesn't mean you should be using a scaled framework. Only indirectly, actually, do those things tie together. But I want to look at that definition. I want to look at the problem that scaled frameworks are solving, because if your gears are turning, you probably heard some things in that use case that you thought, well, wait a second. If that's what's going on at my company, I think we have other issues besides scale. And you are correct. And that's what we're going to spend the rest of this time reflecting on. So the first part of the classic scenario for scaling frameworks is numerous teams. Okay, not big company, but numerous teams. And by numerous, I mean numerous. There's a great case study out there done by Ultimate Software where they had over 25 teams. The development effort had over 900 people involved. They used no scaling frameworks. They just used Kanban and they did fine. And some of those teams were actually pretty large. So I'm not saying that's the magic number. I'm not saying if you have 901 developers or 26 teams, that's when you need a scaled framework. But what I am saying is that at least one organization with that many teams and that many people was able to coordinate their product effort without any scaling framework whatsoever, just straight up Kanban. And if you're not even in the neighborhood of those numbers, I don't even know why you're even thinking about a scaled framework. And this is a real problem because I see organizations that have like 6 teams and they're like, well, maybe we need SAFe. No, you don't. You know, I send emails with more recipients than that sometimes. You don't need a big elaborate framework to coordinate the efforts of 6 teams or, 40 people or whatever it is. So you have to be in some pretty huge numbers before this is even something that you think about. But again, a lot of times organizations are not intentional about this decision. It's just a given. So much so that now we're starting to see companies use something like SAFe or Scrum at Scale. And they're like, it turns out we're too small for these structures to be effective. So now we're trying to figure out how to do safe at a smaller size, right? Or how to do less at a smaller size. This is nuts. It's like, well, we got to be doing safe, but we're not really big enough to effectively do it. So how do we do safe with fewer people than safe needs to be using safe? Why are you even having that discussion? That's crazy. Why are you trying to figure out how to use a scaling framework at your size when your size is clearly too small for the framework? Like that, I just don't understand the thought process there. It's like you've assumed that you have to do safe, come hell or high water, and now you're trying to figure out how to make it fit your 2 development teams or whatever. So just keep in mind that in order for this even to be an issue for you, we need to be talking about lots of people, lots of teams, and not like 6, not like 10, but like getting into the hundreds of teams and thousands of people. If you're not operating at that size and all those people are not all focused on the same thing, they don't all need to be coordinated together, then we don't even need to be having this conversation. Okay, there are other ways to get done what you want to get done that have much lower overhead than all the apparatus and plumbing that comes with a lot of these frameworks. So that was one part of the scenario, right? Are you even big enough for this to be a thing? The other piece of it, though, is it's not just about the number of people or the number of teams. It's the number of teams whose production efforts have to be coordinated for some reason. And I really want to underline that for some reason, because in large organizations, we tend to have a command and control mentality, and we want to coordinate the development efforts of teams just because, it makes our paperwork simpler, or we want everyone to be done on the same deadline for no particular business reason. We just want it, right? But there's a reason, if we're talking about scaling frameworks, we have to have a legitimate reason why massive numbers of teams need to have their delivery coordinated. And typically that reason is either because you have dependencies among these teams, so the timing has to work out just right, or you need all these efforts to hit a deadline or a specific release cadence, and everything needs to be ready at the same time for that reason. Let's talk about dependencies. So we need safe because this team is doing work that this other team is going to depend on. So we need to make sure we coordinate that. And this happens all over the place, right? It's not just an occasional thing that happens between 2 teams. It's got to be a spider web of them, right? So many dependencies that we have to artificially manage the process to deal with those dependencies. So the first question I have to ask you is, you have enough of this product planned out that you have this many dependencies? If that's true, you might want to step back and ask yourself why you care about being agile to begin with. To have that many dependencies across that many teams means you have to have done quite a bit of planning. You have to have quite a few features mapped out to be able to know that's even a thing. And if you have that much work mapped out, that far out for that many people, why are you doing it in 2-week increments? Are you going to pivot at the end of those first 2 weeks? What information are you going to get that's going to turn this train around? Probably none, right? So why are you trying to scale Agile? You don't need Agile. If you've got that much of a plan, you don't need Agile. The whole reason agility exists is so you can be responsive to change. If you're not going to respond to change, what are you doing? So you don't need a scaled framework because you never needed to be agile to begin with. So that's one thing about dependencies. But the other thing is, when we do have dependencies, the solution is not to find a framework to institutionalize the dependencies. The solution is to try to minimize dependencies. Now, I'm not trying to say that companies should never have dependencies. In fact, I think that's almost impossible. Even for small companies, you're always going to have those times when your work is dependent on the efforts of somebody outside the team. Whether it's another development team or not is irrelevant. It could be somebody who needs to get back with you about a requirements question, or, who knows, whatever. You're always going to have dependencies. It's not that the existence of dependencies is bad. but it's just if you have the quantity of dependencies we're talking about, what you probably want to do is look at the way you're organized and see if you can reduce the number of dependencies you have, or maybe even eliminate most of them just by changing the way your teams are organized. Why does team A have a dependency on team B? Is it because team B doesn't have that skill set? Is it because team B isn't working on those items? Well, you could have team B work on those items and have team A work on something else. Or you could change the composition of team B so that they're more cross-functional and they don't need to wait for this other team to produce whatever it is because they have that skill set on their team. So we want to look at reducing dependencies, not how do we create a framework that allows us to have as many of them as we want. Dependencies are a good reason to look at your organization and your process and start to re-engineer. Again, I'm not saying all dependencies are bad and that you should have none. You're going to have them, but when you have as many as we're talking about, right? We have so many inter-team dependencies that I need a whole framework that I'm going to pay consultants thousands of dollars to teach me to do to manage them. That's a lot of dependencies, and many of them are probably unnecessary. So let's look at that, right? Can we reorganize our teams? Can we reorganize the work? Can we use SLEs? So even if teams do have a dependency, they have an expectation of when that dependency is going to resolve. When I did a project for a very, very large financial institution here in town, that's exactly what we did. There was a team of mainframe developers, and normally my team and that team had very little in common, but on occasion, we would build something where there was crossover and certain things had to exist on the mainframe side in order for my team to actually use them and take advantage of them. And we just set up SLEs. How much lead time does this team need in order to have this thing ready by the time we come on the scene? If you've got flow metrics, it's not hard to figure out when a particular team needs to schedule a particular thing so that another team has that available. So you have many, many options available to you before you start installing a very heavyweight framework. Let's talk about the instance where you have a common deadline or a common release cadence that all your teams have to hit together. Again, I have to ask the question, if you have a deadline sitting out there that multiple teams, many, many, many teams have to converge on, what do you need agility for? Because if that deadline can't move, which is the only reason why you would have to have multiple teams converging on it, if that can't move, what are you using Scrum for? What are you using any Agile framework for? The whole point, again, is to get feedback that can meaningfully pivot your product direction and being responsive to that. If we're like, here's the body of work, and here's the deadline for that body of work across numerous teams, again, that's a massive amount of work. And if you have that work planned out and you're like, there's virtually no piece of information short of a meteor strike that would make us change this plan, you don't need to scale Agile. You don't need Agile, period, really, but you sure don't need a scaling framework for it. But the other thing is, again, why is it important that they converge on that deadline or converge at that release cadence? Are we not doing continuous delivery? Is that not a thing? Maybe what we need to do is look at our release process and figure out why it's so contingent on specific dates. Why are we releasing big batches of value on specific dates at specific increments instead of releasing value as it's available? And again, the answer to that question could give us insight into whether we really need agility and whether we need to scale it. So I hope those questions kind of are thought-provoking. I want you to have those questions answered before you start asking what scaled framework is the best for me. Because in my experience, when people are asking that question, they haven't thought about why they need to scale, and they haven't usually even thought about why they need to be agile. But as you ask those questions, I think you'll discover that the thing you're trying to solve by scaling may be much, much better solved in some other way. Your need to scale may be pointing you at problems and opportunities to optimize your workflow without ever having to pay a fancy consultant like myself a single penny. Thanks everyone for listening to Agile Bites. Agile does sometimes bite, but we don't think it always has to. If you enjoyed what you heard today, don't forget to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you happen to be using. And if you can, leave us a comment because we'd love to hear your feedback. What things would you like to hear about? What things did you hear that were valuable to you today? You can also head over to integrityinspired.com to sign up to our email list. But that's all for today, folks. We'll see you next time.